Game of English with Luke Donovan. Matrix verb system. Perfect simple. I'd worked, you'd worked, he'd worked, she'd worked, it'd worked, we'd worked, you'd worked, they'd worked. I've worked, you've worked, he's worked, she's worked, it's worked, we've worked, you've worked, they've worked. I'll have worked, you'll have worked, he'll have worked, she'll have worked, it'll have worked, we'll have worked, you'll have worked, they'll have worked. I hadn't worked, you hadn't worked, he hadn't worked, she hadn't worked, it hadn't worked, we hadn't worked, you hadn't worked, they hadn't worked. I haven't worked, you haven't worked, he hasn't worked, she hasn't worked, it hasn't worked, we haven't worked, you haven't worked, they haven't worked. I won't have worked, you won't have worked, he won't have worked, she won't have worked, it won't have worked, we won't have worked, you won't have worked, they won't have worked. Had I worked, had you worked, had he worked, had she worked, had it worked, had we worked, had you worked, had they worked. Have I worked, have you worked, has he worked, has she worked, has it worked, have we worked, have you worked, have they worked. Will I have worked, will you have worked, will he have worked, will she have worked, will it have worked, will we have worked, will you have worked, will they have worked. Hadn't I worked, hadn't you worked, hadn't he worked, hadn't she worked, hadn't it worked, hadn't we worked, hadn't you worked, hadn't they worked. Haven't I worked, haven't you worked, hasn't he worked, hasn't she worked, hasn't it worked, haven't we worked, haven't you worked, haven't they worked. Won't I have worked, won't you have worked, won't he have worked, won't she have worked, won't it have worked, won't we have worked, won't you have worked, won't they have worked.
Created using Powtoon.